This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, there was one good thing to come out of this weekend. I did not have to watch 6+ hours worth of wrestling. 2 Survivor Series pay-per-view recaps and skimming over SmackDown in a 2-day span. That was quite the chore. Especially coming off the week where I had a Starrcade 86 review and was trying to get over the horror of having to experience the Full Gear pay-per-view from AEW the previous weekend. It's a lot of wrestling. Seriously, I don't know how people find the time to watch that much wrestling. I mean, I managed to do it somehow, but I also skipped over a bunch of crap and couldn't do it in one sitting. But the people out there that still try to fill their week with watching all that wrestling content, I don't even know what to say to those people. It's certainly too much for my brain to handle. I can barely make it halfway through Dynamite most weeks without having a complete meltdown. But in the case of the classic content, it's what makes this show worth it in the end. As bad as some of that ends up being too, especially Retro Raw from 1993, which is on the docket for today. But before we get there, make sure that if you are watching the FSWR channel for the first time, that you subscribe, comment, and like the show. We are on YouTube and Rumble every Monday and Friday for new content. Today, we are finally back to our regularly scheduled Monday programming. Not a moment too soon. We've got Retro WWF Raw that we will be discussing today. In addition, we'll be covering the most recent episode of SmackDown from Friday night. And I can assure you all that 3 hours worth of wrestling is much more doable in a 2-day period than whatever I said earlier, 6? May have even been more than that now that I think about it. If I got paid, then maybe. Or at least if I had a co-host to bounce ideas off of, I could maybe get some entertainment value of trying to subject myself to more product. But flying solo, nope. That ain't happening. Especially when I have real jobs that have nothing to do with wrestling at all. Plus actually trying to manage the channel by myself and doing all the editing. It is time consuming. But no one cares about my personal problems. So let's talk about some of the stuff that I sat down and watched over the weekend. And we will begin with Retro Raw. This would be the December 6th, 1993 episode. So here's what we apparently missed on last week's Raw that we did not review. We missed the Click, all in the ring at the same time. Glad I didn't watch. No, I'm just kidding. Now, at least here, they weren't all going into business for themselves and hugging each other or breaking kayfabe. And Sean Waltman was there too, as opposed to Hunter. Be that as it may, we missed a Razor Ramon Diesel TV match that ended in disqualification when Shawn Michaels ran in and tried to pile drive Razor on the Intercontinental Belt. And of course, we know that's a feud that's been brewing under the surface for a while now. We've had a few instances where Shawn kept trying to stake claim that he was the real IC champion, even after having been stripped of the belt. So now that we've seen Shawn and Razor get physical with one another, you can see that they're ready to shift gears with that program. A feud that carries over into WrestleMania the following year. Yeah, that is how much time they spent building up this program months in advance. And this also set up Shawn and the 1-2-3 Kid for later in the program here. But this Raw is particularly memorable for another reason. It is a sad state of affairs, actually. The closing several minutes of this episode, while still a legendary TV moment for anyone that remembered how it all played out, it is still upsetting to know that by the end of this episode of Raw, it was the last time that we would see Bobby the Brain Heenan in the WWF before he jumped ship to WCW. I will cover all of that more in depth when we get to the ending, but I will say up front, I made the most out of enjoying Heenan's commentary for this episode. So they opened with Shawn Michaels and the 1-2-3 Kid, a non-title match, even though Shawn is still carrying around the old Intercontinental title with him. Last we left with a Shawn Michaels match, it was the 1993 Survivor Series debacle a couple weeks back, where he had to be a last-minute replacement for the Jerry Lawler-Bret Hart elimination tag, all because of the sexual allegations that Lawler had been charged with the day of the show. So Shawn ended up being a sub for that match at the very last minute, teaming with the Three Knights, and we talked about all that in depth on the pay-per-view report, so feel free to watch it in your spare time if you happen to run by it. You'll be shocked to hear this was much better than the Survivor Series match by leaps and bounds. Really, there's not a whole lot to say about the stuff they did. You know, they were both technically sound athletes, so they had an old-school, fast-paced opener. Waltman got to shine early on and get that babyface flurry in that he's well known for. Shawn obviously sold and fed for him well. And they just told a basic story of Shawn knows that Waltman and Razor were friends, so he wanted this match with the kid so he can make an example out of him. It's funny going back and watching this, seeing how much the business has evolved over the years with some of the more high-risk stuff the guys would do back in the day as compared to now. Things as simple as Sean Waltman trying to give Shawn a running clothesline off the ring apron out to the floor, and then Shawn spins it around and counters it with a snap power slam. A very simple-looking reversal spot, but man, we took it for granted how great it looked back in the day when people used to do it. I also missed the spot guys used to do where someone would try to leap off the top rope with something, and then the guy standing in the middle of the ring would just hit him with a standing drop kick out of the air. Nothing overly convoluted, just a very simple counter that looked great, made sense, and it always got a pop. I always like to draw modern comparisons because it is interesting to see how things have shifted over the years with the in-ring product, which already tends to be what most people nowadays really only care about. But you watch Shawn and Waltman here, it's something that would totally fit in with today's product. Put this shit on Dynamite most weeks, it'd be the best damn thing on the whole show. It was a long match, but it never dragged. It was fast moving throughout the whole thing. Neither guy was exposing the business with tumbling routines or choreographed backflips at any point. I did laugh when they came back from their second commercial, and the first thing we see is Shawn hitting 1-2-3 Kid with a super kick. Took me a minute to register. Oh yeah, that was not Shawn's finisher yet. It was just part of his moveset. But at that point, they went into their big angle for the remainder of the segment, because Shawn starts giving Waltman the Razor's Edge, and he keeps pulling him up each time to try and send the message to Razor. So eventually out comes Razor to try and pull Waltman out to the floor, in plain view of the ref, by the way, and he just stood there looking on without doing anything. And finally, they do the spot where Shawn slaps Razor in the face. Razor tries to go after him, and while they're running up the aisleway, Shawn trips on the runway, and he crawls back to the curtain, doing the big beg-off deal, and he pulls himself back just far enough to where Diesel can reach out through the curtain and cold cock Razor in the jaw. And from there, Shawn rips off Razor's shirt and starts choking him out while the officials all run out to try and stop him. And the whole thing ends with Shawn managing to muscle up Razor onto his shoulders to give him the Razor's Edge. And he gives Razor the safest looking Razor's Edge you've ever seen onto the floor. Looked like someone giving their grandmother a chokeslam onto a stack of pillows. So, yeah, well, there's our little heat angle. Made 10 times better with Vince trying to sell the gravity of the horrible situation we just saw. And meanwhile, there's Bobby Heenan screaming for Shawn to come back and give Razor several more Razor's Edges onto the concrete. Trying to justify it after commercial by insinuating that Razor deserved it since he is carrying around a belt that does not belong to him. Oh, Bobby. God, I'm going to miss that man. So for lack of better terms, this is where the show completely fell off a cliff. We followed the great opening 20 minutes with another half hour of, well, the expected WWF Raw comedy circa 1993. We had a Quebecers TV squash where they beat two jabronis in relatively short order, the highlight of which was watching Johnny Polo on the floor in a lawn chair reading a Palm Beach magazine. Because we all want to get that taste of the luxury lifestyle, I guess. And after the finish saw Jacques flip Pierre onto one of the job guys where he basically crushed his head with his ass, they proceeded to beat up said job guy some more, put him into the lawn chair. Also, Pierre could hit him with a clothesline off the ropes. Keep in mind, while this is all going on, they're playing that god-awful Mountie theme music over the speakers. It made the whole thing that much more comedic. Really nothing to add to that segment. After that, we had a brief video pre-tape to promote the upcoming Royal Rumble in January. Our next stop on the road to WrestleMania. We will definitely be discussing that show in detail when we get to the end of January. And moving right along here. Oh, I'd actually like to rescind my previous statement. Remember when I said that the show fell off a cliff following the Shawn 1-2-3 Kid match? I lied. We had another bright spot on the show this week. Owen Hart. This split-screen interview they did with Owen, Vince, and Bobby was truly something to behold. So I should start by saying, last week we also missed the vote for WWF Superstar of the Year in 1993, and the winner of said prestigious award went to none other than Bret the Hitman Hart. And obviously things had boiled over from the Survivor Series pay-per-view where Owen and Bret got into a shoving match after Owen had been taken out of the tag match. So they brought Owen here to comment on his older brother winning Superstar of the Year, to which Owen went into full-fledged jealous younger brother mode and started trying to make the segment all about him. And he vowed that next week he's got a big surprise in store for everybody. And I think I briefly talked on the Survivor Series report how this is probably my favorite period of watching Owen Hart in the WWF. The whole feud with him and Bret headed into WrestleMania is such an all-time classic rivalry. And I'm so glad I'm going to get the chance to go back and relive some of this again. Because it is truly my favorite material to watch when it comes to Owen's career. I know there's still people out there that are big Bret Hart fans, and you know, there's always that debate of who was better between both brothers. I don't know, dude. I mean, I'll admit, it took me a long time to come around to recognizing how great Bret Hart was. Truthfully, I just didn't get him when I was a kid. I always kind of recognized that he was a good athlete, but I just never saw what the it factor was with Bret that everybody was talking about back then. Owen, on the other hand, I always found myself more captivated by Owen's segments in the WWF. You know, Bret always used to bore the shit out of me with his babyface promos, but every time I heard Owen talk, man, he always put a smile on my face. You know, even when he was being the condescending, arrogant prick younger brother. Even as a kid, I always thought Owen was more interesting than Bret was. but we'll address more of it as we roll along in covering the rivalry on television. Tell you what I did not want to cover was what happened next. This fucking doink and dink match. Or whoever the midget clown was. Dink, donk, dong. This whole thing can suck my dong. Here's what I'll say about it. Y'all want to know just how badly Vince wanted sports entertainment and wrestling? Remember, these were the lengths he was willing to go to. Garbage. And like I mentioned plenty of times with Doink segments in the past, they'd have just let Matt Bourne be Matt Bourne. And I'd have to throw him underneath a goddamn clown outfit. Would have been so much better. Great wrestler, terrible gimmick. That's all I can really say about it at this point. Absolute death TV. I was going to use that as a segue into this Double J skit, but that one might have been too easy. I don't even know at this point. Is it ridiculous to say that I'm starting to get a mild sick pleasure out of watching these goofy Jeff Jarrett vignettes? Not only have they gone on for like 8 goddamn months at this point, but every single fucking time I get that screen cap that reads JEFFJARRETT, I just started laughing uncontrollably. Maybe it's that I remember just how absurd the whole thing was after going back and rewatching a few of them. I mean, they're bad, don't get me wrong. They're hokey as all get out, but even by WWF standards in 1993, there were some redeeming qualities about the nature of how this all came off on television. I mean, at least here we got to meet Waldo the Country Sax. He was actually the highlight of the whole thing. Some solid tenor sax playing, followed by Jeff Jarrett making some underhanded comments about how mediocre his level of musicianship was. Meanwhile, Waldo's just standing there taking it like, well, you know, he might have a point there. I think what got me here was the part right at the end where Jeff handed him a $1 bill, and then he told Waldo to make sure that he never forgets where that dollar came from. The real #1 country singer in the world. Good old Double J himself. Hey, I'll tell you what. Hindsight is 20/20. If we would have gotten this version of Jeff Jarrett over the next 10 years and not the fucking guitar-breaking, zero-dimes-drawing, slapnuts wannabe main eventer Jeff Jarrett, the guy that helped run 2 companies into the ground, I probably would have been more tolerant of him. You know, say what you want about Vince McMahon, but he was at least smart enough to know what part of the card Jeff Jarrett belonged on. The other Vince that booked him in the other promotions, not so much. They were a little too close, if you know what I mean. By the way, I'm curious, when the hell does Jeff actually debut? I might have to look this up now. Like I said, these vignettes have been going on for so long now. I'm starting to wonder, does he actually ever debut for the company? Let's see, I'll just type in Jeff Jarrett. Some nice pictures of him. All right. God, even his wiki page is like way too big. All right, I'll go to WWF. All right, his wiki page says... Oh, wait, no, those are the start of the vignettes back in late October. Oh, here we go. December 20th. That is apparently when he actually makes his in-ring debut. Got 2 more weeks of this. These pre-tapes went on for 3 months? Good God. No wonder this has felt like an insufferable trudge. Well, that was WWF for you in the 90s. Milked the shit out of something to the point where you're just wondering, are you actually going to pay it off at any point? Anyway, the main event of the show was Crush in a TV squash. Speaking of milking programs, the thing with him and Macho Man. Can you believe they carried that story on for well over 6 months? That's almost unheard of in today's business. You know, especially for something involving two guys that aren't in the title picture. I mean, I guess WWE's modern comparison for today would be whatever they're going to end up doing with Sammy and the Bloodline, but I mean, that's a program that'll probably still end up involving the title at some point. But going back and remembering like strict singles programs with two guys not involving championships, I can't think of the last time WWE drew a program out that long before paying it off. I mean, 6 months is a long time. Doesn't always seem like that in wrestling terms, but it's quite a while. Anyway, I didn't have a whole lot to say about the match. Crush had what you would call an extended beatdown session. The main takeaway was Randy Savage being on the phone with Vince and Bobby. Horrible audio feed for the phone call, by the way. And the deal with Savage here was that he was in Europe while this Raw was going on, so he was not physically at the building. He was also in a completely different time zone too, so whenever Savage was making this call, it had to have been 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. But, you know, he's plugging his return for the show next week, and I think they said he'll be wrestling one of the head shrinkers. He at least got out that much before the conversation became completely inaudible. And Bobby Heenan covered up for it perfectly by talking about the reason the audio feed was terrible was that it was hard to have a conversation when you're hiding underneath the bed, implying that Savage is afraid to get in the ring with Crush. Classic heel delivery from the Brain. And speaking of the Brain, well, that's probably a good time to transition into the closing moments of the show. Oh, by the way, Crush won after giving the job guy a guillotine drop off the ropes. But they set this up perfectly right before the commercial pitch, because all night long, Bobby Heenan was taking shots at Gorilla Monsoon on commentary, based on their little interaction at the Survivor Series pay-per-view where Monsoon teased punching Heenan. And basically for the entire 45-minute program, Heenan spent literally the entire show taking shots at Gorilla Monsoon, calling him a slimeball coward, a gutless ape, telling him to go chomp on some bananas, the whole 9 yards. And this was all under the impression that Gorilla Monsoon was not at the building to respond to him. But right at the very end of this Crush match, Vince McMahon casually blurts out under his breath to Bobby Heenan that Gorilla Monsoon had recently got off a local phone line, saying that he's somewhere in the area. And, of course, Bobby immediately upon hearing this begins wetting himself, going, "What do you mean local phone line?" So I immediately started laughing because I remember this segment very vividly. But they come back to the desk, and they're trying to do the outro plugs for next week's Raw. And while they're in the middle of their conversation, Gorilla Monsoon begins walking down the aisle toward the commentary desk. And it's so amazingly timed because while Vince's attention is averted to the camera, Bobby Heenan is looking down at the screen, and he clearly sees his impending doom walking right toward him. So his eyes begin to bug out, and like a total 1950s sitcom, he begins stuttering and panicking as Monsoon edges closer and closer to the desk. At which point, Vince immediately welcomes Gorilla to the desk and throws Bobby Heenan under the bus, asking if he heard any of the comments the Brain made to him earlier in the program. So at this point, Gorilla leans over Bobby, and he informs him that he's won a free round trip. And he grabs Heenan by the scruff of the collar, and he begins dragging Heenan out to the back. Of course, Heenan is selling it perfectly with begging and pleading for his life. And they get all the way through the forbidden curtain, straight through gorilla position, which was a perfect symbolism. And finally, Gorilla drags Heenan to the back entrance. He grabs Heenan's luggage that was sitting by the doorway, and he tosses both the luggage and Heenan out the back door. While Heenan's trying to gather all his belongings that spilled out of the bag, he begins tripping and bumbling over his own 2 feet and winds up revealing his dirty underwear for the whole world to see. And right before they cut away, you see a frustrated, semi-broken down Bobby Heenan give the sayonara signal to the camera before the fadeaway. And this is one of those TV moments that you remember afterwards for how heavy the situation truly ended up being, especially once you read into what really happened. When I saw this for the first time in '93, I remembered it for being a great comedy write-off, but at the same time, I also didn't know what was going on behind the scenes with Bobby Heenan, and I also didn't know that this was going to be his last appearance on WWF television, because he winds up debuting for WCW, I think, the next month. Am I right? Could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure he is in WCW by like January of '94. So the long and short of it is, for those that didn't know, obviously we know the track record of Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan. You know, they worked together through the late 80s on WWF programming. I think it was in the late 80s when Heenan took over for primetime wrestling on USA and started pairing with Monsoon. You know, and go back and watch the clips of them on YouTube. I mean, those guys had impeccable chemistry together. Just the kind of natural ability to play off one another to where you couldn't even script out a lot of what those conversations were. I mean, it was just a perfect pairing of 2 great minds that knew how to interact with one another. You know, and obviously they were close. So Gorilla kind of knew what was going on with Bobby Heenan's personal life around this point. I believe the story from what I remembered was that Bobby Heenan was supposed to take some time off and eventually return as a color commentator in early '94. But while he was away, his contract had also come due with the WWF, and WCW had already kind of been in negotiations to get him to jump ship to them. And the catalyst in that whole decision for him was the fact that A, he could work a lighter road schedule with fewer dates, and B, he was going to get health insurance. And obviously we know the WWF did not offer that, and they still don't to this day, despite being a publicly traded company. So this truly ended up being the last time we ever saw Bobby Heenan in the WWF. And, you know, I think the stories had come out years later that right after this taping, Heenan and Gorilla had met together at the hotel they were staying at and basically had a long heart-to-heart embrace over everything that had gone down in Bobby's personal life. And, I mean, here's the thing. It's hard to describe this final segment with modern interpretation, knowing what we do now about the whole story. If you watch this back and you see the way Heenan starts breaking down at the end of that segment, it was eerily strange. Part of me really believes those were actual tears of agony. I don't think Heenan was faking that. Like, you could tell he was legitimately broken up about everything, and you could really see how important the WWF was to him. You know, the moment he looks at the camera and does the little salute, those weren't fake tears. Like, those were tears of a man that had been going through a lot of struggles. You know, and especially when you remember how Heenan's health had deteriorated years after, and, you know, especially after the whole throat cancer scare in 2002. It's always difficult going back and talking about Bobby Heenan's stuff. You know, obviously he was a great gimmick, such a wonderful mind for the business, and, you know, I know it's cliche to say it, but I still maintain the opinion that he may genuinely be the single greatest wrestling manager of all time. I mean, I always get choked up thinking about the latter years of his life and all those health complications he went through in the late 2000s, you know, even into the 20-teens. It's just, God, it sucks. The whole thing just sucks. But Even though we got to cover a handful of Bobby's color commentary with Raw before he split, it really has been one of the highlights going back and watching some of these retro Raws. The interactions between him and Vince, him and Macho Man, it's all been phenomenal. And I got the opportunity to hear him provide some stellar work in WCW, even to the bitter end when things were just totally beyond the point of saving. But Bobby Heenan, even during the dying days of Nitro, he was always a high point. I really wish I got to see more of him in his prime because, I really only caught the tail end of his run as a commentator when I was growing up. And as great as he was there, I really wish I had gotten to see him as a manager. And as big a fan as I was and still am of Jim Cornette, I think even Corny would own up to the fact that he was not on Bobby Heenan's level. Like, Bobby Heenan, he was special. He was a real one-of-a-kind talent that you rarely come by in the business anymore. A great talker, a great worker, great performer, great overall mind for the business. He really was the overall package. I'm going to miss covering his stuff on Raw. When you go back and think about it, this is kind of an iconic episode of Raw. Funny thing is, probably at the time, it really wasn't all that special. It was just an ordinary episode of Raw. But knowing what we do now about the whole Bobby Heenan situation, it definitely stacks up among the all-time important Raws in history. It's a sad situation, but not all moments are good, memorable moments. Guess you can look at it that way. But, generally the show was fine. The opener was a lot of fun. You can already see they're starting to set the stages for WrestleMania. You can see creatively where they're visioning certain guys. Again, we haven't even hit the new year yet. It's almost incredible to remember just how far in advance Vince used to book that stuff. But he did. And he stuck the course with a lot of it. So, I guess it'd be a good point to transition over to SmackDown. What do you say? A show that was interesting. We opened with Sami Zayn versus Sheamus, and I will get my brief initial critique out of the way now. Can we fucking cut it out with the Brawling Brutes Bloodline matches? Jesus Christ, these constant matchups are annoying. Particularly with the Brawling Brutes. Isn't it like every week on the show where we have to hear that stupid Celtic music open the program? Of course, Michael Cole still has to interject with, "It's fight night!" God almighty. So I'll talk about the match in a minute, but let's cover the promo segment with the Bloodline beforehand. Moreover, let's just spend a few minutes drooling over how awesome Sami Zayn is. I'll say this. First off, the promo was just a way to dress up the Bloodline and put over their victory at War Games. Jimmy and Jay established that they're all on good terms now and everything's all sunshine and rainbows with the group from now on. Supposedly. And they did their whole little goofy hand clap embrace thing at the end, which got a huge ovation from everyone. Sammy said he was feeling pretty frickin' oozy. At that point, I jokingly wrote down in my notes, the Bloodline is officially the best, worst heel faction in the history of wrestling. They're just way too entertaining to be bad guys at this point. It's almost like Horseman level entertaining now. But as far as Sammy goes, I had a big revelation when I was watching him here. I watched a lot of Sami Zayn during the whole first run in NXT years ago. I remember watching the way he had sort of gained that rapport with the fans. He was a great babyface, hell of a worker, great personality, really good promo. He had so many of the tools when it came to building someone to fit that WWE machine of what they were looking for in top talent. The only thing that he was always missing was size, and he never really had the greatest physique in the world. Wasn't exactly the prettiest guy, didn't really resemble the mold of Vince's vision of a top babyface. But I always thought, looking back at some of my favorite moments in NXT, some of my earliest memories that I love to go back and rewatch are some of those Sami Zayn segments. Of course, he ends up suffering the same fate as a lot of those poor developmental stars did when he got called up in the main roster. Floundered in the mid-card, wasn't really treated like a big deal. I don't think Vince ever really got it with him to the same degree Hunter did. It's a shame it's taken this long for them to finally catch on to just how good the guy actually is. I was never the biggest El Generico fan in the world. That was a gimmick that never really resonated with me. But when I started following his work in NXT and I recognized that the guy actually has a natural ability to get over and be a star, I latched onto his stuff dating way back then. I'm glad he's finally being given the opportunity to shine after all those years of wasted potential, because I always knew Sami was talented. And he's especially been great in the little toady stooge role with the Bloodline. I still have no idea whether or not he's supposed to be a face or a heel in the whole dynamic, but at this stage, who really gives a fuck? And the guy's massively over, and the people love this Sami Uso stuff. As for the actual match with Sami and Sheamus, I think I liked it better when Sheamus was wrestling Gunther. Not that the match was bad or anything, it was good, but it was just kind of a match. Sheamus ran wild early on. Sami cut him off after Sheamus got distracted looking at the Usos on the floor, who were doing absolutely nothing at the time. Just kind of falls into the playbook of dumb baby faces. There are plenty of dumb baby faces on this episode of SmackDown, by the way. We'll get to more of that. But Sami took over for the, quote, heat. And by that, I mean the fans were chanting Sami Uso while Sheamus was getting worked over. The match also went through 2 commercial breaks for God knows what reason. Why they needed to stretch out a 10-minute TV match into almost 20, your guess is as good as mine. It really didn't even pick up until they came back from the second break and started building up to the big angle at the end. But they get to the final few minutes where the Usos are trying to run interference for Sami, which led to the evident spot where Butch and Ridge get into the ringside brawl with the Usos. Because, apparently we don't see that enough, except for like in every goddamn Brawling Brutes Bloodline segment. Meanwhile, the entire time, Jessica Carr, the official, just standing there looking on, like, oh, hey, check that out. People brawling on the floor. Don't see that too often. Perhaps I should do something about it. Or maybe I'll just stand there like an idiot and let it happen. So finally, Sheamus catches Sami with a running knee, but as he sets him up for the Irish Curse backbreaker, one of the Usos runs in and super kicks Sheamus while the ref was dealing with the other Uso. All that overbooked hubbub going on at the very end just to give Sami a fucking TV win. Talk about the epitome of putting a hat on a hat. But, I guess they established here that the Usos and Sami were finally on the same page. And they pointed out how Jay willingly stepped in to help Sami at the end. So they at least tied together some loose ends there with their little ongoing beef. So that was the opening deal. First 30 or so minutes of the program. And at that point, I tried to fast forward through a couple things that weren't of grave interest to me so I could try and find something interesting. I did catch a quick Bray Wyatt pre-tape where he was giving us some kind of evolutionary biology lesson on animals, and yeah, that's all about I got out of that. Oh, and apparently he wasn't the one that killed LA Knight. I guess it was Uncle Howdy. Yeah. I know. I should just accept the fact that I know this is all probably going to be shit at the end, but for whatever reason, there's still that part of me that wants to see that train wreck actually pan out. It's like witnessing a car crash. It's horrifying, but no matter how so, you can't help but watch. But on the topic of watching things, well, guess what I did not watch? Yep, you guessed it. Girls wrestling. Okay, here's all you need to know about this segment. It's Shayna Baszler versus Emma. They proceeded with a backstage deal where Emma, for reasons that are never explained, establishes that she has a crush on Madcap Moss. She's smitten by his amazing genetics, apparently. And they spend almost an entire minute with Moss trying to put over Emma as a trailblazer for women's wrestling, saying that she belongs in WWE because she helped steer the course for the women's revolution or something. So, of course, she proceeds to go out to the ring, get her ass handed to her by Shayna, and eventually tapped out to the Karafuda clutch. Yep. Glad I didn't need to stick around for that complete and total burial. It was made twice as good by Shotzi trying to run out afterwards, only for Shayna to immediately lay her out like a complete fucking geek, only to finally get run off by a one-armed Raquel Rodriguez in an arm brace. So, hold on. Let me get this straight. Two healthy individuals were completely incapable of stopping Shayna from an attack, but a one-armed, gimped woman was able to run off the heel without having to lay a finger on her. That's WWE logic for you. They also aired a vignette for Lacey Evans in training. Yeah. Lacey Evans is still a thing. They're apparently going to try to get her over for the 83rd time in the last 2 years. Good luck with that. So at this point, we went to this Kofi Kingston-Gunther match, and I was very conflicted. I've made I don't know how many statements at this point about how the New Day gimmick has such go-away heat with me now. To even dignify their segments with a response would be giving them too much attention. As soon as that music hits, and out come the bubbles and the rainbows and the hand claps and the fucking pancakes, I immediately lose brain cells by looking at it. However, I skipped a lot of shit on the show this week, and as bad as a lot of that New Day crap is, I love Gunther. I figured he was going to be able to get something watchable out of Kofi here. So I tried to put my revulsion for the New Day gimmick on the back burner to try and watch this match, even if I had to end up watching it on mute. So what I did is I skimmed through segments of the match to try and find some of the highlights. And aside from the first half where Gunther was chopping and beating the shit out of Kofi, there weren't a whole lot of highlights. They do an angle where Gunther goes to set up Kofi for a powerbomb, and that is when Brawny the Strowman's music hits. So he comes out to kill Kaiser and Vinci at ringside. And they followed that distraction with Kofi giving Gunther the SOS for, well, not the 3 count, but a near fall, which also was their pitch to commercial. And at the point they come back from break, not only is Gunther now back in control of the match with no explanation, but Brawny and Gunther's lackeys have completely disappeared from ringside. I have no idea where they went, but they completely vanished, never to be spoken of again. At which point, Gunther and Kofi proceed to have a regular WWE-style TV match, where Gunther still winds up winning clean at the end by hitting Kofi with a new finish. Would someone like to explain to me what the fuck I was missing in that segment? Was that not the most counterintuitive booking you've seen for a wrestling segment in the last month? No, that's not fair. AEW's done far worse in just the last week alone. But this is still plenty wacky. Speaking of wacky, I think Bayley might officially be my new favorite heel in the business today. One step behind MJF. God, I forgot just how great she was as a smug, catty asshole. standing there in the ring telling fans in the front row to sit down, making fun of their stupid hats, doing a completely cartoonish, over-the-top promo on how Damage Control was in the War Games match for almost an hour and a half. Meanwhile, the people chanted for Becky Lynch, who was only in the match for a cup of coffee. Bayley's so good, dude. I think I can just go with a 2-hour SmackDown program of Bayley doing smug heel promos. I'd be fine with that. It sure would have been better than whatever in the hell this segment was supposed to accomplish. So Damage Control are in the ring for this promo. Dakota and Io, I forgot to mention, yeah, they were there. Just twiddling their thumbs like they have been for the better part of the last 4 months. Bayley eventually gets to the point where she starts calling out the girls' division for being cowards and not wanting to fight them, apparently. So that brings out Liv Morgan, who tries to stand up on behalf of the rest of the locker room. And like a complete dumbass babyface, because every babyface in WWE is a fucking Nimrod, apparently, she tries to charge the ring at a 3-on-1 disadvantage, apparently expecting that she was not going to get her clock cleaned. So you'll be shocked to hear the heels end up beating the crap out of her. Who would have ever seen that coming? And while the beatdown is going on, who should then make her return to television but Tegan Nox, who I believe was also part of that chopping block set of cuts that WWE let go sometime last year. But she ran out here with about 59 different hair colors and very long bootleg cut jeans. Looked like incredibly uncomfortable street attire to be trying to make a run-in with. Now, I guess I could ask the question of, was Tegan Nox just happening to stand in the back by Gorilla when all of this was going on? To where when she made her run-in, they also were able to put up graphics and her theme music at the same time? Are we led to believe that this was not an unexpected run-in? If so, then why did Tegan wait until Liv Morgan was getting her ass kicked to then make her run-in? Again, I know I ask these questions expecting rational answers, and I know I'm not going to get it, but it's just things that rattle in my brain when I'm trying to make sense of wrestling, which is, I know, it's a bad idea, just, it sucks, watch it, roll with it, get over it. I get it, fine, whatever. Okay, so, of course it's Tegan Nox's first time back in over a year since getting fired, so what happens when she runs out? Well, of course, she gets her ass kicked and laid out by the heels. Hell of a return for Tegan Nox. Glad her moment of shine lasted all of about 3 seconds before they cut her knees out from under her. So at that point, I just fast forwarded through the rest of it because I pretty much saw all that I needed to. Tegan Nox has returned to WWE television, and they immediately lay her out like a fucking dork. Excellent booking. Superb. So mercifully, we come to the main event of the show. It is Ricochet versus Santos Escobar in the finals of the World Cup tournament, wherein yet again a segment involving Legado del Fantasma. The highlight is anything that pertains to Zelina Vega. So, of course, she's on commentary, but she gets the boot about 2 minutes into the match for hitting the ring. Damn it. I will admit, one thing in wrestling that never gets old is the referee doing the big dramatic, "You're out of here" ejection to the heels. It always gets a pop. So, once they did their little angle with the heels getting thrown out, they ended up trying to have a somewhat modern-style WWE match, whatever that means. While I'm never particularly an advocate of heels doing flashy, high-risk moves just because of the nature of heels getting babyface pops for doing impressive-looking moves, when Escobar hit Ricochet with that suicide tope through the ropes and pretty much rammed through Ricochet over the announce table like a fucking long dart, that might have been the goddamnedest thing I've seen in wrestling all year. If you didn't watch this match, you have to watch it for that one spot. When I tell you that Escobar had to be going at least 40 to 45 miles per hour when he dived into Ricochet, I am not kidding. That was an amazing spot. And again, I'm usually pretty iffy on the overexposure of guys doing suicide topes in wrestling anymore because we see them so often. But when Escobar hit that on Ricochet, I was like, oh, if you're going to do it, it's a way to make an impact with it. I mean, I went back and watched it like 8 times in a row, and that was before they aired all the replays. Every time I went back and watched it, it was more impressive each time. Like a friggin' torpedo. Generally, I didn't have any major qualms with the match. There were definitely a lot of flashy moves, but, again, unlike watching an elite match in AEW, it never really crossed the line of just being outright ridiculous, where everything turns into a 1950s acrobatic stunt show. Both guys worked hard. The crowd stayed with it for the most part. Even with all the high-risk stuff going on, it still looked like 2 athletes trying to have a legit fight. I love that double collision spot they did in the ring where it looked like both guys cracked their heads against each other. I mean, it even looked great in slow-mo, too. Wouldn't say I was a particular fan of the tightrope walk spot in the barricade where Escobar gave Ricochet the Hurricane Rana onto the floor. It looked a little too choreographed for my liking. I'll say this about Ricochet, and I think I've talked about this before. I wouldn't say I've ever been the biggest fan of his. I remember watching a few of his matches in NXT and enjoying them. I remember he had a great match with Adam Cole at one point at one of the takeovers. I vaguely recall him getting involved when they were doing the whole Dusty Tag Team Tournament thing too. He does a lot of big crowd-pleasing stuff. Lots of dives, lots of flips, and while it's never been my flavor necessarily, he usually does it in moderation to where it works in the WWE environment. Guarantee if he went to AEW and did the same thing, he'd be doing this kind of stuff cranked up to about 150, and he'd probably end up causing more wear and tear on his body by doing so, especially if he was going out there and doing it every night. Again, it's not particularly my favorite style of wrestling, but done in moderation and under the right circumstances, I can be all right with the style of match in smaller doses. It's like going back and watching old Nitro clips when the cruiserweights were doing their thing, and it stood out on the show because it was different from what all the other main event guys were doing, so I can appreciate that. It's just the problem in today's business where everybody works the same style of match where it doesn't stand out, and then it all just kind of blends together and it's not special. But just thought I'd throw that out there. But this match worked. The guys seemed to have pretty good chemistry together. It wasn't the cleanest match from start to finish, but most of what they did worked for the audience. Again, I wasn't a fan of it all. I didn't like the spot on the barricade. I'll always hate the Poison Rana spot. I think that move's the dumbest fucking shit in the world. It's worse than the Panama Sunrise in terms of exposing the business as phony. And somehow it's seeped through the cracks in WWE where they're letting these guys get away with it. But I did like the finish. Ricochet hitting Escobar with the big 630 splash and getting the clean win. Got a big pop from the crowd. They let Ricochet pose at the top of the ramp with the cup. Then they immediately followed that with Gunther coming out to do the stare down, because we know the winner of the tournament also got an Intercontinental title shot. So, they set something up out of it. That's good. So that was the WWE World Cup. Something tells me I should have been more excited for that than I wound up being. I don't know, maybe it's just the fact that I've been so overexposed to tournaments in wrestling, literally in just this year alone. Again, they're not really all that unique anymore because we see them so often. And, while I know Ricochet at least gets a title shot out of winning, it also doesn't seem like that big an accomplishment for winning a fake trophy. I mean, does he have to carry the World Cup trophy with him on the plane when he travels from city to city? Is that just going to be part of Ricochet's gimmick now? He's going to come out on television every week with a giant-ass trophy? Or who knows, maybe it'll completely vanish and we'll never hear about it ever again. I don't know. I'm also interested to see if they actually have Ricochet end up beating Gunther for the Intercontinental title. I mean, they went to such lengths to give Ricochet this big win and build up to that title match. Maybe they'll finally have Gunther drop the thing. You know, Ricochet wouldn't have been my first guy to do it with, but if they are going to do a title switch, this would be a way to put that over. So we will see. I mean, it could be a great match if they build it up for the Rumble pay-per-view. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of Ricochet's work, but I mean, Gunther can get a great match out of a fucking broomstick, so I can't imagine that match wouldn't be worth seeing. But, you know, we'll find out how they pay it off. Maybe they just wind up blowing it off on SmackDown toward the end of the year and then move on to something else for Gunther headed into the Rumble event. I still would love to see another rematch with him and Sheamus because those guys had some really good matches together too. So, there you have it with SmackDown. Yeah, there were definitely peaks and valleys with this one. The middle chunk of the show was kind of a hot mess, but, you know, by and large, the opening and closing was pretty good. They set up some stuff for next week, including an Usos tag title defense, which I'm not looking all that forward to, if I'm being honest. You know, the whole speculation of who's being slated to win the Rumble match is still kind of up in the air at the moment. It's always fun to throw out those probable names, and while Sami Zayn looks like he's being teased left, right, and center, they could go with him. But I don't know, man. After that little deal in the back this week where the Usos were talking to each other about the whole Sami situation, I don't know, the gears started turning in my brain a little bit. I'm starting to wonder if they're setting this all up for them to fuck over Sami in the Rumble match. Like, I could definitely see a scenario where they build up these TV segments with, you know, the Usos helping Sami win his matches and bailing him out when he needs it, only to wind up throwing him out of the Rumble match and then screwing him over that way. I mean, that right there, that could get some Bryan Danielson level heat from the fans. All they need to do is have Sami take some plants to surround the ringside and then hijack an episode of SmackDown with Sami Uso t-shirts on. And right there, you have your Bryan Danielson 2.0 revamp for WrestleMania season. Actually, it might not be a bad idea in theory. But again, I'm not the booker, just a speculator. And I'm speculating that we're about ready to wrap things up here for this episode. Again, make sure y'all subscribe, comment, and like the podcast if you have not done so already. Check it out either on YouTube or Rumble, your personal preference, whichever. We will be back this week for another classic review series and the Dynamite Report. The normal Friday schedule, in other words. Again, I'm still trying to piece together something to close out the year. 2022 top matches of the year discussion, more or less. Not sure when I'd wind up doing that, but it would probably be sometime in the final week of the month, since I'll probably have a little bit more free time to put something together. You know, I'll probably want to go back and refresh my memory on a couple of those matches too, just to recall whether or not they actually deserve making the list. I have a Word document with a lot of them on there, but it needs updated, because there have been some recent matches that I don't think I included on that list yet. One of them I know for sure is that Sheamus Gunther IC title match they did in the UK. And that's still one of the more standout matches of the year for me. But, you know, I'll keep putting the list together as we roll along. Hopefully I can come up with at least 20 to put on that list. It'll be a struggle because 2022 has mostly been a shit year for the product as a whole. But I'm sure I'll be able to find at least 20 to add to the list. Most of them will probably involve either FTR or MJF. But them's the breaks. Until Friday, though, take care, all. Peace.